Hi everyone, welcome to today's lecture, which is very briefly about post-painterly abstraction and mostly about the Neo Avant-Garde, a label that's used by art historians to group together a bunch of artists who were kind of the first to break away from high modernist abstraction and start new trends in art that are a huge part of contemporary art today. And they don't just start the mid-century, they actually start before this, but we'll get to that in a moment. So then, let's start here just briefly. Again, Clement Greenberg was an amazingly influential art critic in the middle of the century. At a certain stage, and there's probably never been an art critic with this much power in the United States, or frankly, maybe even in the world, except for maybe one or two in the 19th century. He was so supportive of abstract expressionism and a particular idea about modernism, right? The advancement towards, or progressive advancement towards, this essentializing tendency within all of the arts. That not only did collectors listen to him, not only did artists listen to him, but he put on his own exhibitions and really continued to support that trajectory that started way back with someone like, Edouard Manet or before, and continued all the way through the abstract expressionists into the next generation of artists who made work. And in one of his exhibitions, he titled these artists the post-painterly abstractionists. Now, the big difference for some of these post-painterly abstractionists, not all of them, but certainly people like Morris Louis and Kenneth Nolan, is that were you to ask them what their art was about, they would not say that it was about anything. They tend to be art for art's sake people. They tend to be willing to say that my art is about creating an amazing aesthetic experience for you, and the way that I can do that best is by reducing painting, they're both painters, my painting down to its essence and really focusing on the impact of color and form on the viewer so as to produce what, again, Clive Bell and Roger Fry once called an aesthetic emotion. Clement Greenberg, by the way, doesn't use the term aesthetic emotion. He substitutes the term quality, but he's roughly talking about the same thing. In other words, they're art for art's sake people. However, one kind of hovers in between those. That's Helen Frankenthaler, and so I just wanted to briefly bring her up here. I said in the last lecture that for a brief period, Helen Frankenthaler was dating Clement Greenberg, and I always like to show this photo because here's the main photo of Clement Greenberg, right? He's kind of hardcore. He's always smoking. Frankly, he wielded his power as an art critic quite naturally and with a lot of force against particular artists and against other critics. I mean, he comes across as a bit of a hard ass. And then you see him here with Helen Frankenthaler, and, she's like, oh, Clem, you're so funny. It gives you another side to them. Anyway, Helen Frankenthaler was a little bit younger generation of abstract expressionists, frankly. Sometimes they call them the second generation, who got put in the show of the post-painterly abstractionists. Her work's slightly different than theirs in that if you were to ask her what she's about, she would say she was trying to express feelings, things that had profoundly kind of influenced her or impacted her, became a part of her that then she needed to express on the canvas. So, for instance, here is this work called Mountains and Sea from 1952. She is actually developing stained canvases right around the same time period that Mark Rothko is doing the same stuff. She's kind of at the cutting edge of this. But in Mountains and Sea, the starting point for this, and you can barely make it out in some of the imagery, it's still slightly figurative. This looks a little bit like a sailboat out on the water, is that she was in Nova Scotia for the summer, and she said she just felt like she was filled up with the natural landscape. It was just bursting out of her, and she would go to her studio and let it flow out on the canvas. So one example of this, again, I'm just going to go through some of these quickly. Or this work called Small's Paradise Again, it's like a Rothko. She's basically using really diluted oil painting and staining the canvas itself so that there is no differentiation between one thing sitting on top of the other, right? There's no feeling of the actual texture or thickness of a paint sitting on top of the canvas. It's actually fused into it, which for Greenberg means even more essentializing of that field of the canvas itself, or this great one, Flood, where she's literally pouring this on there and just kind of moving the canvas around to get these gorgeous colors and shapes that for her are evocative of nature. Artists like Morris Louis, and you can remember these titles or not, they're all kind of throwaway titles. This one's called Tet, or Blue Veil, was not really interested in communicating any content at all. In fact, these artists, in this case, Morris Louis and Kenneth Nolan, looked at the abstract expressionists and thought, wow, this is really great stuff, but these guys are way too caught up in trying to communicate something, elusive like Jungian collective unconscious, and all I want to do is create this amazing optical experience for the viewer. In other words, they take Clement Greenberg's ideas about modernism and they say, what's the next step? What can I do that's along this line? And one of the things, again, I said Greenberg's thinking about modern artists saying everything that's in a painting should just point back into the painting. In other words, I don't look at this painting and say, oh, it looks like a house, and think of something outside of the painting, or even, oh, this is about the contents of the collective unconscious and some other content that's outside of painting, right? Some kind of thought. These guys say, let's take it one step further and make the painting all about the visual form of painting, an optical field, a stained canvas, right? Something that's just about the formal effects of painting, not in order to communicate anything other than, right, this idea of beauty, this idea, or, what we would formally call beauty, or an aesthetic experience, or just the wow factor of visual form. So I'll show you a few of these. This is Tet Saraban, and basically what he's doing, you can probably see this, is they're huge canvases, just pouring the very, very liquefied oil paint at the top and manipulating the canvas so that it runs down and stains into it and does all this blending of different colors with one another. Right? So one after another of these things. This is no end. Kenneth Nolan does many of the same things, but in a more kind of hard-edge form most of the time. Same set of ideas. I'm not going to make you think much about these. I just want you to know that Greenberg's ideas continue on. And by the way, if you like this stuff, if you're like, that's kind of cool, the entire collection of Clement Greenberg actually ended up at the Portland Art Museum. They were one of the few museums who was willing to take it, so they ended up with it. And they have some really pretty cool Kenneth Nolan's and Morris Lewis's, if you're into basically abstract painting as cool designs, right? So all optical effects. That last one was called N-Half. This one's called About. They're throwaway titles. Again, the titles are just supposed to be a way that you can refer to a work of art. They're not really about any kind of content. And if you stare at these things for a while, you'll start to see all the optical plays where they create their own depth of field, but only through the interplay of our eye perceiving the wavelength of one color differently than another and generating this optical space. Or think about, in this case, how he starts in the center and spreads out and plays hard edges against the painterly edge on the outside. These are all kind of formalist games. Or this one, if I leave this up there for too long, you're all going to hate me. This one's called Purple in the Shadow of Red, where you'll see this thing all day. It's like some weird back and forth thing, or Go Dogs or something. This one's called Graded Exposure, right? So those are these types of works of art. They are produced during an age in which lots of institutions now are supporting modern art. There are tons of galleries that are opening up selling modern art. This is one of the stacks, the way that we store paintings in the Museum of Modern Art, filled with Kenneth Nolan's works, to give you an idea of the culture that these were produced for, and also something to do with the scale. Where I want to spend the majority of my time on this lecture here near the end of the quarter is just to give you a sense of how things changed in the really in the late 50s into the early 60s in the United States first, and then all across the globe, frankly, where we have kind of the end of the modernist period and the beginning of the postmodernist period. And so the trend of art towards abstraction kind of reaches its apogee and tails off, although there's still plenty of abstract artists out there today. And some new things start to show up in the world. Now, the term that we use to associate a number of artists who are part of this trend in another direction, this kind of first flowering of things that later will become known as the postmodernist moment, we call the Neo Avant-Garde. Avant-garde itself is a term taken from French military culture. It's the advanced troops out there kind of softening up the other side so your infantry can come up. In other words, they're cutting-edge crack troops. And then that term was taken and applied it to cutting-edge artists who are, what it's meant to say is they're a bit ahead of their time, right? They're doing things that maybe the public's not ready for. They're taking risks. They're out there at the forefront, and then other people follow along with them. Neo, of course, means new. So when I say Neo Avant-Garde, or an art historian says Neo Avant-Garde, they're talking about artists in the 50s and 60s who reprised movements that occurred first at the beginning of the 20th century. Those earlier movements, Dada, Futurism, Surrealism, Constructivism, and so forth, we call the avant-garde, or the historical avant-garde. Now, one of these guys transcends both. The older man that you see on the right-hand side on the screen is Marcel Duchamp. He was a French-born artist, but he worked the vast majority of his career in the United States. In the middle is John Cage, who was a mid-century musical composer who also had a massive influence on this younger generation of artists and was deeply influenced by Marcel Duchamp, although he will take his ideas. He'll take Marcel Duchamp's ideas and he'll push them in slightly a different direction. But these two guys, as you got from your reading, the Duchamp-Cage aesthetic, embraced ideas that were counter to the existentialist philosophy that was at the root of a lot of things happening with the abstract expressionists and expressionism in general. They tended to both want to kind of really make us think about, and in different ways, either contest or embrace ideas about what art could be or how you would think about art. Both of them tended to want to get rid of the idea of the specialized artist, although for different reasons. So let's go into some of that here. Marcel Duchamp got famous in the United States during the Armory show, where he exhibited this work called Nude Descending a Staircase. It was his version of something that's kind of like a futurist-inspired form of cubism. I have no idea at this point. I've looked into it. I can't quite figure out why exactly it was the case that Marcel Duchamp's Nude Descending the Staircase was the painting that people found so provocative. I mean, there are a whole host of things in that show that they could have also taken issue with, but this was the big one. It may have something to do with, it was a critique of that idea of the female nude, not quite sure. In any case, they went after it, right? This is just one of the cartoons that came out making fun of the Armory show and Marcel Duchamp's work. It's called Rude Descending a Staircase, and then the parenthetical title is Rush Hour at the Subway, right? So frankly, if you create controversy with your work, oftentimes that will at least get people to pay attention to your work, and then you may or may not stick around beyond that. He did stick around, although he didn't keep painting. What he decided to do, and this is why it is so important to so much art from 1960 forward, when he was rediscovered, because he's doing these things at the beginning of the century, first of all, is he did tons of art that make you think, that's very conceptually oriented. As a matter of fact, he constantly railed against what he called retinal art. And by that he means art that appeals to the retina, art that appeals to the eye. Art for art's sake for him was like the worst thing ever. What a waste of time to just create empty patterns. He wanted art that made you think, art that he said impacted your gray matter, meaning your brain. And oftentimes what he was wanting you to think about, and this is a commonality among a lot of really avant-garde artists, is all of the received knowledges, all the things that you take for granted, the way that you've naturalized certain conventions, and then you just kind of live by them without thinking about them anymore. So they're the big ones. Like, for instance, here, what he did in this work called 3 Standard Stoppages is he wanted to make us think a little bit about the way we measure the world, right? The way that we give meaning to the world by imposing our own ordering systems on the world. So I'm sure you've all heard the million different stories about, like, how did we ever come up with the distance that we call a foot, right? Was it the actual length of some great ruler, and then that became the unit of measurement that the entire world goes by? But the point is, very rarely do we think, like, why do we use that measurement? And why does the rest of the world, by the way, use instead of a foot, use a meter, for instance? And that's what Duchamp is doing here. What he did is he took a meter-long piece of thread, he held it 1 meter off of the ground, and then he dropped it. And it would fall, and it would make these contours that you see on the outer edge of these pieces of wood, and of course it would be a different length depending on how much it folded up in those contours. And then he marked that. He created these basically 3 new rulers that are based upon these new units of measurement, 3 standard stoppages, right? So now you've got 3 new rulers by which to make sense of the world. But his point is really not about actually using these. It's about thinking how many of these ways that we make sense of the world, that we order and organize the world. And he doesn't just mean like units of measurement, although those are big ones, right? Why a day? Why an hour? Why 24 hours? Why seconds? Like, why do we make sense of it that way? And what kind of impact does that have on us? But beyond that, like, why do we think in the ways that we do? Why do we assign these ideas or concepts to things and then forget that we made it up in the first place and not go look back at them again and say, is this the right way to be thinking about it? I'll just give you a for instance, and this will drive some people crazy and other people will go, yeah, okay, I get it. Let's talk about gender, right? A lot of you will say, listen, there's 2 genders. That's just the way it is. There's male and there's female. Some people have one set of plumbing. Other people have other set of plumbing. And that's the binary that exists. And a lot of people say, wait a minute, there's not genders that way, because gender is the way we understand what those 2 different sets of plumbing mean. And it's a big kind of fluid system. What Duchamp would be doing is basically saying, listen, if you come at this one way and say, hey, it's all just a binary, what happens and why is that good to think that way? Why is that useful? Why wouldn't you think, like, what are the other options to categorizing people instead of by their biological sex? Maybe there's other more important ways to do it. Or maybe there's just kind of let's, and this is standard for a lot of artists, let's make us all think about the world in new ways by pulling at the threads of some of the received knowledges that we have, some of the things that we take for granted, so that we have to think about the world anew and maybe progress in our thinking about things. A for instance, of course, famously is his Mona Lisa mustache. This is a work that he produced, again, early on. This is 1919. In which what he's done is he's taken a picture postcard of the Mona Lisa and he's done a very minimal amount of work on it. He's put a goatee on her and he has written the words LHO, or the letters LHOOQ at the bottom, right? So what is he doing here? Right? How is this supposed to exercise your gray matter? Well, one of the things that occurs to me right off the bat is, why is it the case that the Mona Lisa is so famous? Why is it the case that in 1919, when you leave the Louvre after visiting it, everyone needs to buy a picture postcard of it? Why is it the case today when people go to the Louvre, which is the huge museum in Paris, they all flock to see this work? It's basically given its own room. There's a huge queue waiting outside. You know, people filter into that room and then everyone holds up their cameras and takes a picture of it. Why? Like, why is it so famous? And frankly, why is it the case that you take a picture? You can get a better picture of the Mona Lisa, any one of us, on Google if that's what we're going for. So that's how it exercises your gray matter. Why is this the icon of Western art? What makes it so famous? And as I always say to my students, honestly, the key is in the context here. Only a few years before he painted this, the Mona Lisa was an important work of art, but hardly something that people would flock to see. It was, as you saw in Samuel Morse's The Gallery of the Louvre, one of, 50 paintings that were on the wall, not even given an importance in place, nothing particularly special. And then, of course, it was stolen by an Italian janitor. It went missing for almost a year. No one knew what happened to it. There were articles in papers across the globe, trying to figure out what happened to the Mona Lisa, who stole it, when was it going to show up again, what is this all about? And over the course of that year, with all this media frenzy, that's what really made it so famous, so that when it was finally discovered, when this janitor, by the way, tried to sell it in Italy, he thought that Napoleon had stolen it from Italy, and he was going to get it back for the Italians. So he stuffed it in his in a little box at the end of his bed. Then the heat was on. He didn't know what to do with it, so he just sat on it for about a year, and then he tried to sell it to a gallerist who immediately turned him in. When it was made public again, of course, it came back into the museum with lots of fanfare, and suddenly it had this new status as really, really important art. So, he's making us think about that, but he's also making us think about something else, which is, why do you need a postcard picture of it, right? It's not even a good picture postcard of it, is it? Or let's take it one step further. Why do you take a photo of it when you're at the Louvre when you can get a better one on Google? And the answer is probably so that you can show other people how cool you are for having seen the Mona Lisa, right? It's a little kind of badge of the fact that you went and saw it. You had this experience. Even if, and this is key, even if, like most people who stand in that line and get in that room and, jockey against all the other tourists trying to see it, the experience was hardly worth it, right? Hardly a very interesting experience at all. And then there's some other things going on here too. Like the big one is can we consider this a work of art, right? What makes a work of art a work of art? Because after all, taking someone else's work and claiming that it's your own is, for most of us, called plagiarism. And in this case, just taking a picture postcard, which wouldn't have been acceptable as a work of art, putting a little bit of a goatee on it and writing some letters underneath it, that's not going to be enough to call it a work of art, is it? Well, back then it certainly wouldn't have, because he's not doing any of the things that we think are key components of art. Skill, creativity, originality, anything of that. Where do you find this in an artist who just scrawls a mustache and a goatee on her and writes some letters underneath? I mean, how many of you could do this? Well, probably most of you skill-wise, but for Marcel Duchamp, it's about making you think again. He called these things ready-mades, where he would take something that already existed and exhibit it as a work of art. He would take something outside of the context of art and move it into the context of art, like a gallery space, and say, here, this is art. And in this case, this is what he would call an assisted ready-made, where he did just a little bit of work on it to make it supposedly a work of art. The final little way that it plays with us is Marcel Duchamp loved visual puns. He loved little word games. These are ways to talk about how meaning actually works for him that I'm not going to get into. But some of you may know that Sigmund Freud actually interpreted all of Leonardo da Vinci's work right around the same time period that Marcel Duchamp made this. And you can imagine what Sigmund Freud does to Leonardo's work. As a matter of fact, he thought that he had made a major discovery when he realized that Leonardo da Vinci was gay. Everyone at the time knew he was gay, by the way. And that his works were filled with hidden symbolism about his, distressed relationship towards his mother. Because, of course, for Freud, anyone who's gay has got some kind of pathology. And then he read everything in a Leonardo da Vinci work as a symbol of homoeroticism or latent gay tendencies and so forth. So anytime you saw like a nose that's too big, oh, that's a phallus, or a bird with a long beak, oh, that's a whatever. And remember that Duchamp was actually hanging out with all the surrealists. They were all his friends. He was kind of associated with those Dadaist turned surrealists. And so he read this thing, and they must have just been dying laughing, because you want to know how Freud interpreted the Mona Lisa and all of the mystery of her Mona Lisa smile. He said that the Mona Lisa was actually, like, clandestinely a self-portrait of Leonardo da Vinci, apparently in drag. And you can just imagine those surrealists dying laughing. And here he puts a goatee on it to say, oh, it's like, a guy. That's the hidden trick. And then the letters down below have to do with this kind of playfulness with meaning. If you sound them out in French, L-H-O-O-Q in French, if you sound each letter out individually, instead of the way it looks here, which is like look carefully. In French, L is L, and H is H, and O is O, and O is O, and then Q is Q. If you say those all kind of quick together, it sounds like Elle a chaud au cul, which means roughly something like she's got a hot ass, which was a little bit of a slang term having to do with homosexual communities at the time, like she's got a hot ass, or she's hot for it on the ass, and so he's probably playing with that as well. In other words, something that seems deceptively simple can get pretty complex if you start thinking about it. And that's what his ready-mades were primarily up to. In this work from 1917, so a few years before, called The Fountain, the context is again very important. It is exactly what you think it is. It's a urinal that's been rotated 90 degrees, and the very minimum you could possibly do to it to call it a work of art has been done, meaning that he signed it, although not with his own name. If he had signed it Marcel Duchamp, knowing that this was an artist, people might have accepted it. He signs it R. Mutt, and he puts a date on it, and then he tries to exhibit it. Now, the place that he tried to exhibit it is really important. He tried to show it in one of the first independent exhibitions in the United States. Now, these independent exhibitions were meant to be free and open, and anyone who paid $6, in this case, could exhibit any work they wanted without having to worry about a juried selection, right? So if you tried to show your work at the New York Academy of Design, someone would say, oh, this isn't classical enough, and it would kind of limit the possibilities of exhibition of works of art. So people associated with the Ashcan School and with Stieglitz put on this independent exhibition, and Marcel Duchamp, who had already, of course, experienced a ton of independent exhibitions in Europe, decided to test how open they actually would be by, as far as we know, going to a plumber store, buying a urinal, doing this minimal amount to call it a work of art, paying his $6 and trying to get it exhibited. Now, it didn't end up getting exhibited because they thought this is some kind of joke or some kind of prank, or just like, that's it, this is not art, we're not putting this in the show. Immediately after that, Marcel Duchamp took this to Stieglitz, who took this one photograph. This is the only photograph of this original work of art. It's very nicely lit, right? It looks a little bit like a Buddha. It looks a little bit like like some kind of Madonna form or whatever. Later on, by the way, many modernist photographers will do things very, very similar to this, like Edward Weston's famous photograph called Excusado, which is a picture of a toilet, is kind of similar. And then he put it in front of a Marston Hartley painting in the background. And then finally, he wrote a whole bunch of, or he and his friends wrote a whole bunch of articles about it, raising a stink about why this couldn't be art. Remember, this is an assisted ready-made. So on the left-hand side of this article called In the Blind Man, which was an art periodical, he says, calls it the Richard Mutt case. By the way, the name R. Mutt that he chose actually came from a comic book, the Mutt and Jeff series. Goes through and says any artist paying money is supposed to be able to exhibit it, but this work was refused. The key part is over here on the right-hand side, and I'll let you read through this whole on your own if you want to pause this or look at the images from the lecture. Whether Mr. Mutt with his own hands made the fountain or not has no importance. He chose it. He took an ordinary article of life, placed it so that its useful significance disappeared under the new title and point of view, and created a new thought for that object. What he's saying here, fundamentally, and this has had such a massive impact on art from his day forward, especially in the 50s and the 60s to the present day, is what makes something art is not implicit qualities that it has, like the arrangement of formal elements to create significant form, or its connection to convention. What makes a work of art is our acceptance as viewers of it as art. And our acceptance of something as art comes from things that are familiar to us, right? Things that are acceptable to us. What he's saying here is that if you think of this as art, it's possibly art, right? If you're able to conceive of this as art, that's all you need for something to be art. Or another way to put it, the more important way to put it is, here is this thing that he's calling the fountain. What's going to make that art, right? To make us think about it art is not the thing in itself, but everything surrounding that thing, both physically and conceptually. What we call the frame, a conceptual or physical frame. If today you go into a museum and you see something in that museum exhibited, you're going to think that's art, right? And why? Because the frame of the museum itself, an established institution of experts, says this is art, and so we accept it. Or let's take those formalist paintings we were just looking at. They're just big washes of paint, aren't they? But the frame there that might make us think of that as art is the conceptual frame of formalist art criticism that says, if you think about it this way, in relation to these conventions, this is art, right? In other words, what he's saying is art is a construct. Everything is a construct. It's a concept, and that concept is more or less forceful, more or less compelling, based upon how it convinces us as the viewer. As a matter of fact, one of Marcel Duchamp's very few but very important essays is something that was titled The Creative Act from 1965, in which he said, what makes a work of art? Art takes place between two poles. It's the artist putting an idea out in the world and the viewing public receiving and accepting or not accepting that art, right? It's both creation and reception that makes something art. In fact, this is a really good example of this. And I'm not going to take you through all the ins and outs of this, but I do want you to know that it's out there. This is his famous work called Étant Donné, a work that he had been working on probably from the 40s through the 60s when he died, but no one knew he was working on it. See, Marcel Duchamp was doing a bunch of exhibitions, helping the surrealists and turning out little tiny objects here and there. But for the most part, he had told everyone that he had retired from art to become a chess grandmaster, which, by the way, he achieved. He actually was a chess grandmaster. But all the while, he and his wife, and probably a couple of other people, were busy on and off creating this work that was then installed, after his death in the Philadelphia Museum of Modern Art, called Étant Donné, which roughly translated in English, or in the English title he gave it, is called Given, Won the Waterfall to the Illuminating Gas. But you don't need to know that subtitle. It refers to another work that we haven't covered here. And it is exactly what it looks like. It's real doors in a brick frame that are off to the side of the Arnsberg collection in that museum where the vast majority of Marcel Duchamp's work is exhibited. And when you go look through it, this is what you see. Now what you see is taking place through a little kind of shallow, darkened space, through those two peepholes in the door, and on the other side you see what looks like a real figure, although its anatomy is a little weird. It's a three-dimensional figure lying in real twigs, holding aloft this little flickering lamp in front of what in the background is a very hyper faux landscape painting. It's really believable, but believable in that way that really hyper real things are, where you're like, it's too real to be real. It's a little bit like a Bob Ross landscape, if you know who that dude is. And then off to the other side over here, this is a waterfall feature. And the waterfall is one of those light boxes that something's moving in and flickering, and it makes it look like, again, a hyper-real waterfall. So what the hell is this all about, right? What's going on here? And by the way, the figure's nude, and you're looking kind of directly at her crotch, and you can probably tell her crotch doesn't look anatomically correct. It's not quite clear what the hell you're looking at there. Well, a lot of this has to do with the way that he situates you, that you're standing in front of the peephole again. You are the voyeur looking on to the scene. And remember early on when I said, vis-a-vis the female nude, that the voyeur position is a very powerful position. It puts you into a position in which you see the world according to your unique viewpoint. You don't have to take into account anyone else's viewpoint. It's masterful. And as a matter of fact, he had probably read Jean-Paul Sartre's famous passage in Being and Nothingness, this existential philosopher. This famous passage in which Sartre describes his feelings standing in front of that keyhole, looking at the world. And he never tells you, if I remember correctly, what he actually sees, but he does describe in detail this feeling of power, this feeling of mastery, this feeling of the world is unfolding just according to my unique viewpoint onto it, right? But just like Sartre, and in this scene as well, eventually someone's going to walk up behind you in the museum and see you. You're probably not going to be aware of this because you're too busy trying to figure out what the hell Marcel Duchamp is getting at here. But in Sartre's scene, standing at the keyhole, and then he turns around when he hears footsteps coming up the stairway, and now he's been caught in the act of being a peeping Tom. And in this moment, of course, all that feeling of mastery, of power flees from him, because now he has to see himself not according to his viewpoint, but he has to circuit his way of seeing himself through the viewpoint of this other person who sees him as the creepy peeping Tom. Now, Sartre is telling the story to get to a fundamental part of our reality, which is we're constantly seeing ourselves and making sense of ourselves through the presumed eyes of others, right? Through making sense of ourselves through things outside of ourselves, that we're never in that perfect position of power. But he also makes clear that that perfect position of the voyeur looking onto the world is the position of truth if it were spatialized. And I know this is going to get incredibly esoteric for many of you, but if you imagine the idea of truth being there's one right way to understand things, right? This is the only correct answer. It's not a matter of different perspectives. That's truth, right? That one peeping hole, that one viewpoint, that one perspective onto the world, that both of these people are putting you in. However, in Duchamp's work, not only do you eventually get caught, and this happened to me the very first time I went to see this. I'm not joking. I was probably about your age. I was in my early 20s, and I had just decided to be an art historian. I went all the way to Philadelphia on a road trip. I didn't know about this work at all, and I just sat in front of this and looked at it, and I was trying to figure out, holy crap, what is this thing? What's Duchamp trying to get at here? How does this relate to his other works? And when I turned around after, I don't even know how long I was in front of this, there were these two tiny little old ladies looking at me with these kind of nice smiles on their face, like, oh, what's that? And I just remember feeling like so self-conscious. Like, oh my God, they're going to walk up and look through this peephole, realize I was staring at a naked woman's crotch in a museum. They're going to think I'm a weirdo. So it does the same thing, but also does it through some of the imagery that's in here, one of which is the nude female form and the view on her genitalia, which is associated with works of art known as the origin of the world works of art, where women's bodies are seen as the beginning of all things, right? The procreative force in the world. And this is called, in philosophy, the myth of false beginnings, one way to think about it. So that you say something like, and you'll hear people say this all the time in the realm of physics, if we just knew what happened in that nanosecond before the Big Bang, we would know more about the nature of the universe, right? If you just knew what happened earlier on, you could trace forward in time how that's changed over time, right? So chasing things back to those false origins doesn't really get you anywhere, because there's always an earlier moment. The other symbolism here, though, is a woman holding aloft a lamp. We have that in the United States. The Statue of Liberty was actually lifted from French classical art of the same nature, a woman who is nude holding aloft a lamp that is a symbol of what the French call veritas, or truth. A symbol of the light being shined on the world, a symbol of enlightenment, thought, and so forth. Another symbol of truth in this thing is that it's set up a little bit like a diorama. And if you've been to an old museum of history, you will have seen these before, where they take, oftentimes in particular, tribal people, and they will put them into this little kind of mock-up. For instance, it might be Plains Indians, and you'll put a mannequin of an Indian, and you'll dress them up and put, an arrow in their hand, and dress the mannequin with a buffalo skin, and put them next to a teepee in order to make the illusion even more real. So a way to make truth again. Or frankly, these hyper-truthful landscape painting or new forms of technology that simulate reality, like the light waterfall in the background. In other words, it's a piling up of images of truth, right? Including setting you into the viewpoint of the voyeur, only to collapse it when you get caught, only to make you question, why do I think this is true? Why am I seeking truth? Is there really truth, or is there just a matter of different perspectives? That's the kind of situation he wants to set you up in. And here he is, end of his life. I can just imagine him, if there's a heaven, he's up there laughing at us trying to figure this out. And that's a marvelous chess set created, by the way, by Max Ernst. So let me pause here before going into Cage. So, though Duchamp had been working, obviously, in the beginning of the century for a while, except for his impact on European artists, he didn't really have much of an impact on artists in the United States, partly for the various reasons that I talked about, abstraction not having much of a foothold. And if you think of Duchamp as way, way out on the cutting edge, or frankly, way out on the fringes of artistic activity, it makes sense that there wouldn't be a lot of artists in the United States interested in following him, except for very few. He, however, is in a way rediscovered, or his ideas become very, very useful to a number of younger artists who are introduced to his ideas both directly through him, but also through this guy, John Cage, who is an American composer associated with the New York School of Composing, these very, very cutting-edge composers in the United States who were pushing the limits of what was understood as musical sound. And Cage, for his part, will be a little bit like the middleman between Duchamp, who was older, maybe more aloof, less in contact with the younger artists, and a group of younger artists who are even younger than Cage, who are interested in Duchamp's ideas, and Cage became a pathway to those ideas, as well as an introduction to Cage's very related ideas. Now, I'm not going to go into all the ins and outs of this really, really kind of fundamentally important character. I just want to give you the basic guidelines. What you're looking at him doing here is he's doing what he called the prepared piano, which he actually developed here in Washington when he taught and composed works at Nellie Cornish College early on. And he was interested, Cage was, even before he got really interested in Duchamp, in extending musical sounds to all of the sounds of the world. He called this non-hierarchical music, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But if you think about it, you can see why you might be drawn to Duchamp. Cage thought we only take particular sounds and call those musical sounds, right? They're sounds that you can chart out on a musical staff. And if they don't fit there, if they're, let's say, the sounds that are atonal sounds or sounds of birds chirping or whatever it would be, those are the sounds of nature. And so you get this kind of, again, dichotomy about this is art and this is the rest of stuff. And he wanted to create a kind of spectrum of sounds that could be used in nature. And one of the ways he did that really early on was to, I said create sounds that could be used in nature. What I meant was create sounds like natural sounds or any other sounds, industrial sounds, sounds of the radio sounds that are just around us, and use those in his music. The way he did this in a prepared piano is he basically stuck various different objects in between and on the strings to make them play sounds that they weren't originally intended or tuned to play. So he made the piano in a way a percussive instrument, like you would put a nut or a bolt or a piece of rubber in there and it would totally change the sound. Now, why is he doing this? Again, part of this is because he thought it was a way to break down hierarchies, to create sound that wasn't just all those things that we are already familiar with. He really wanted to open up your mind to the possibility of more sound being something that was available to music. And so when he looks at someone like Duchamp, who I always think of Duchamp as kind of pointing to the frame, saying, this is why we think the way we do. If you think about why the Mona Lisa is famous, it has to do with these things that are outside of the Mona Lisa, right? If you think about the way we measure the universe, think about our attachment to truth, is there even such a thing? In other words, he makes us think. But for Cage, he looked at something like the ready-made, and he said, there's the answer. What Duchamp is saying, according to Cage, is anything can be art. There are no intrinsic qualities of things that make them art and other things not art. And if that's the case, then why don't we try to create, in his case, music that makes everything art, that opens up our mind to everything being art? He once said art should imitate nature in its manner of operation. This is a quote that he used a lot. Art should imitate nature in its manner of operation. It's a key quote because for him, to create music based upon chance and based upon non-hierarchy, meaning not one thing more important than the other, mimicked or imitated nature's manner of operation. If you think about it, in the natural world, without the imposition of human values, no one thing is better than anything else. I know a lot of times students say, wait a minute, there's natural selection, or you've got the food chain. One thing eats another thing. But that doesn't have to do with value. That has to do with strength, or that has to do with, frankly, even when it comes to natural selection, a whole bunch of chance in there. In other words, it's human imposition that says this is better than that. And on the other hand, of course, nature at a fundamental molecular level is ruled by what he calls originally chance, what we might call, and he later calls, indeterminate relationships. And some of you know this. When you take like Physics 101, they tell you everything's ruled by hard and fast rules. And then as you go up the chain to theoretical or quantum mechanics, suddenly everything's just wackadoodle, right? Everything's not ruled by any principles at all, that at a fundamental level, we cannot entirely predict what is going to happen, right? So at a basic level, nature's manner of operation is non-hierarchical and full of chance. Now for Cage, though, the reason he wanted to create musical compositions that were based upon chance and based upon non-hierarchical relations, and in his case that's relations of sound to one another, was because he thought it would be a better way to live. He was actually deeply influenced in the late 40s by Eastern philosophy. He had already been working on these other ideas about creating this kind of extensive field of sound open for music. But then he read Zen theories in particular. He took classes later on with D.T. Suzuki at Columbia, who was a teacher of Zen philosophy in America. And what he heard over and over again from these Eastern philosophies and even from Western mysticism is that the way to open up our minds, to actually open up our minds to enjoyment, to fulfillment, and to pleasure, would be to get rid of your sense of self, or get rid of the imposition that your mind and your desires place upon the world. Again, this was a big idea at the time. If you think about Zen philosophy, one of the root things that it says over and again is you have to basically, it's called self-abnegation, or today we might call it mindfulness, not get too caught up in what you like or dislike, or in the way that your mind, having been taught for ages, makes sense of the world. These are all human impositions on the world that stop you from seeing the truth of what in Eastern philosophy is usually called kind of the ultimate reality of things. But for Cage, what he's thinking is, if you get your mind and your desires out of the way and let life act of its own accord, you will wake up to what he calls the excellence of everyday life. Another way to put this is, imagine that instead of having a world of which you hierarchize experience, where you say the best thing is this and the second best thing is this, and I really like this and I kind of like that, and this isn't very much fun and I hate that, you would say it's possible to, at any moment in time, experience anything as equally pleasurable or fulfilling or what he calls excellent. An example might be you're waiting to listen to your favorite music, and Cage says, well, yeah, but your favorite music is something you've already heard a million times. It's not going to change your mind about anything. What if you could open up your mind to the possibility that any sound or combination of sounds was just as excellent as your favorite music? Wouldn't that be amazing? And at the root of this is the Zen idea, of course, that the only moment that you're truly alive is this moment, which is constantly, of course, fleeing into the next moment and the next moment. And if you're living in a world in which you are locked in ideas about the past, like, oh, that was so much fun, or thinking about a future moment in expectation of it, like, oh, I can't wait to go to that concert or go to that, have dinner there or go see that art exhibit or whatever it might be, you're not actually present in your now moment. And what if, thought Cage, I can use music to make people think about the possibility that every single moment of their life could be just as excellent as any other moment. And this is where another idea got in his head, something that is very complex, but I'm just going to give you the simplest version, which is what he called silence. Now, for Cage, silence is a really interesting, what he calls pseudo-concept, in that there is no such thing as real silence. Now, we have the concept of silence, the absence of sound, but you will never be alive in a moment in which all sound is absent. It's not a real thing, right? You think of it, it's all relative, so it's made up, right? There is no absolute silence. And the way he confirmed this is that he went to what's known as an anechoic chamber, which deadens all ambient sound, and he lay down in it. And he realized he could still hear things because, of course, he could hear his own body working, the high whine of his nervous system and the beat of his heart and circulation of his blood. There's always going to be sound. This is a confirmation for him that our concepts are limited and oftentimes inaccurate to the world that we live in. And further, that when you silence both your mind and your desires, you can allow that now moment and non-hierarchical, again, affection, excellence of the world into your life. One of his most famous compositions, as you will have read about, is 4 minutes 33 seconds, where at Woodstock, not the big rock concert in Woodstock, but the same place, he had a concert, and one of the compositions was a very virtuoso pianist getting up on stage and for 4 minutes and 33 seconds not making a sound, just sitting at his piano, closing the keyboard, and allowing the ambient sounds of the world around him and around all the viewers to become, or in this case auditors, to become the musical composition, thus filling The sound space with chants, meaning whatever chants sounds were made at that time became the musical composition. Absenting or silencing his own desire, Cage's, to impose upon the world his own musical piece, and allowing the viewer to supply or practice this idea of being kind of caught up in the now moment and enjoying the excellence of everyday life. He taught classes at the New School of Social Research on advanced composition, where some of the most important artists of the 1960s associated with performance artists took classes. So here you see some of that. They did kind of fun assignments like this. You can tell that Cage, in this assignment that was created by Alan Capro, who you'll hear about in a moment, told them to go create sound based upon durational sounds. Durational sounds for Cage are important. They're sounds that are made by a musical instrument that has no ability to change the sound itself or extend the sound. So unlike, let's say, a guitar whose strings have been made to hold sound for a long time, or a piano where you can push on a pedal and make that sound start or stop. Durational sounds are things like this is a durational sound, right? That sound that's created by my hands coming together can only last so long. It's only going to be a particular timbre based upon the actual medium of my hands coming together. So in this one, it's blow a bottle, scratch a screen, and then you can tell someone just like got stuck and decided, if I put a knife in a breadboard and fling it back and forth and it goes do 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 do, that's a durational sound. One of my favorite artists involved in this, and I'm just going to give you a quick run through of a couple of major works by theirs, I'm not going to go into any details here, is George Brecht. George Brecht goes on to create endless versions of things like this, but this one's called Motor Vehicle Sundown, an event, which was, you can see up here on the right-hand side, devoted to John Cage. It's a performance work in which you turn your vehicles into a musical concert. And I actually did this with some of my students one time, invited me to do this. We all went to the Arboretum and did something like this. So here's the way the directions work. Any number of motor vehicles are arranged outdoors. There are at least as many sets of instruction cards as vehicles. The instruction cards, by the way, are on the left-hand side. Each one of those numbers represents a different instruction card that would be created. All the instruction cards are shuffled collectively, and half of each deck, are distributed to a single performer per vehicle. At sundown, relatively dark open area incident light of 2-foot candles or less, the performers leave a central location, simultaneously counting out prearranged duration, 1.5 times the maximum required for any performer to reach and seat himself in his vehicle. At the end of this count, each performer starts the engine of his vehicle and subsequently acts according to the directions on his instruction cards, read consecutively as dealt. And you go through the whole thing, right? So here's what you do. You run your card. You've got all these cards, 22 of them. Maybe half of them, you see that 23 through 44 might be silences, where you just sit and let the ambient sounds of the world take the place of your instrument, which is your car. But the other ones are things like turn on your headlights, turn on your parking lights, put on your foot brake lights, horn, siren. I don't know who the hell had a siren on their car at this time. Bells, accelerate the motor, turn on the windshield wipers. And if you've got like 10 people doing this, you can imagine how this becomes a new kind of concert that draws your attention to, again, being able to accept just the sounds that your cars make as just as interesting or enjoyable, or as Cage would call it, excellent, as any other concert that you might go to. For his part, Alan Capro, who goes on to develop what are known as happenings, which were, as people say, if you were alive in the 60s, you knew what happenings were, because at a certain stage they were everywhere, and they took a ton of different forms. He was, at least in this work called The Spring Happening, really attempting to wake you up to the excellence of everyday life, a la Cage, but by overloading your sensory inputs. A spring happening, what you're looking at here is a rehearsal. And the man with the lawnmower is between these 2x4s that make a long corridor that was actually closed. You can actually see the walls of this corridor off to the sides. They're tar paper walls that originally were up enclosing this long corridor where the audience was pushed into the space. They'd all walk into the space. There were curtains on both sides. You would pack it with more people than, let's say, would quite comfortably fit in this, and then you may be able to see this, but the walls actually had little cutouts on the side to witness things that are happening outside of the space. And outside of the space there are all kinds of sounds, from motors, engines, musical sounds, steel drums, radios being played, people singing, people banging things together, and so forth. There were smells. They had freshly cut grass that they would smash up. They had coffee. They had oranges. They had lights going on and off right and left. They had performers. There were things around this space and on top of this space. And you were in the space. Again, think of it. You're in this tight little dark space while all of this sensory stuff is blasting around you. And you're just kind of being overloaded from it. And most of it is just kind of everyday sounds. Until in the last moment, what happened is this man showed up at one end of the corridor with this power lawnmower, the old kind with those big cylindrical blades out front, and started pushing it into space, collapsing everyone and kind of heightening their sensory inputs even more. The other wall at the other end of the space, curtain was open, and there's a huge industrial fan that blew air in from the other side. And just about at the last minute, the walls that were rigged to open up just fell to the floor, and everyone just stopped what they were doing, all the performers, and left the space without saying a single word to the audience, who was left wondering what the heck just happened, but maybe walked out into the world being more aware of all the sounds around them at every day, because in Capro's mind he had done something like Cage in drawing our attention to all of the wonderment of the world in order, in this case, by kind of oversensitizing us to it, so that we might enjoy it. Totally different approaches to this took place through some of the painters who were associated with Cage and Duchamp. In this case, you see Cage over on the left-hand side. In the middle is Merce Cunningham, who, of course, did what Cage did to music, to dance. They were partners for their life. And then off to the right is Robert Rauschenberg, one of the painters who was deeply influenced by Cage and Duchamp. Robert Rauschenberg did a whole host of things in the 1950s that caught everyone's attention. One of the first is things like this. This is like Cage's silence made into a painting. It's called the White Painting, and he did a few of these. On the one hand, what you're looking at must just strike most of you as like, oh my God, this is why I hate art, right? It's just a white 3-panel painting that is being exhibited as art. On the other hand, it's a really smart thing to do, because remember what Greenberg said, and in a way, Rauschenberg is doing Greenberg's, like what Greenberg wanted everyone to do, but he's pushing it so far to its insidious extreme that it stops working. He's reducing painting to its essence, a flat field, in this case with almost no pigment. It's just completely white, and he's saying, here, this is the perfect example of modernist painting according to Greenberg. Or, and there's more to that, but I'm just kind of keeping it brief here for today. Imagine this painting called the Erased de Kooning drawing by Rauschenberg. And in this case, he takes an abstract expressionist artist, right? And remember what abstract expressionist is all about. Profound human content, universal language of form, the idea of imprinting that content on the page, reducing art to its essentials, and so forth. He goes to them, goes to de Kooning, and he asks him, can I have one of your drawings? Because what I want to do is erase it and exhibit it as another drawing. And at first, de Kooning thinks he's, being made fun of, so he kicks him out. But later he lets him do this, and he gives him a really pretty difficult drawing to erase. And then Rauschenberg sets himself the task of erasing as much as he possibly can until he can't get any more off. And then when he gets done with that, exhibiting it as a work of art. So stop and think about this. On the one hand, drive probably a ton of you crazy. On the other hand, you think, well, this is conceptually kind of interesting, because in the end, can you make a work of art out of destruction? Can you make a work, if this is a work of art, whose is it now? Is it a de Kooning? Is it a Rauschenberg? Is it some kind of collaboration, right? What is it that makes art art? He's going at that Duchampian question a little bit different way. Or one of his most famous works, Bed. And in Bed, you're looking at exactly what you think you are. He's taken his bedspread, a quilt, and he's taken his sheets and the pillowcase, and he's framed it, hung it on a wall, and painted it with these kind of marks that look a little bit like abstract expressionist drip paintings, and said, can this be art? Can you accept this as art? Now the thing here is that it's not just as simple as taking any old thing and just saying, can this be art? He's mimicking abstract drip paintings, but he's also doing some things that should break the rules that Clement Greenberg put in place that are so forceful in the 1950s. But maybe they do, maybe they don't, right? Because in what way does this break Greenberg's rules? One thing you might think of is it refers outside of itself to a real bed. But doesn't everything refer outside of itself somehow? If you see a color on a painting that's the same color as the shirt you're wearing, does it refer to your shirt? This is obviously no longer a bed. But then you would think, well, it's three-dimensional, it's a sculpture. Wait a minute, though. Aren't paintings on stretchers all the time? Aren't they fundamentally three-dimensional? Or another one might be, well, it's got patterns on it. Well, that's clearly a quilt. Well, those patterns are the same kind of abstract patterns that you might find in a painting. And the quilt, by the way, is fabric in the same way that a canvas is fabric. And you can keep going on with that, because the place that he puts all of the drip activity is up by where you rest your head on the bed. That may be associated with the idea of the kind of dreamlike state that abstract expressionists put themselves into to tap into their collective unconscious, and so on and so forth. In other words, he's creating art that is highly conceptual, and in this case meant to critique or make us think our way through some of the fundamental propositions that Clement Greenberg put out there that maybe aren't as straightforward as we once thought they were. And later in his career, he started to kind of mix different mediums, get very interested in the idea of the impact of advertising on the world. This one is a work that is called Odalisque, based upon, well, female nudes that cropped up in Europe in the Orientalist tradition, so erotica, basically. And what you're looking at is actually, it's a stuffed rooster on the top, and a light box here, and some kind of stand and a soft form down here, and it actually plugs in and you can turn it on, which is his little pun, right? Because much of the imagery that's on here, you can probably see this one here, are nude or erotic figures that turn you on, just like advertising at this stage and even today is meant to play with your well, it's meant to, the sex sells kind of thing. Make you desire something by putting up a beautiful woman or a beautiful man and then substituting whatever the product is. Now, there's more to it than that, but we'll leave it there. The other artist, a friend of Robert Rauschenberg's and a little bit less so John Cage, is Jasper Johns. And he did a lot of the same types of things. You see him here with his gallerist. This is also the major gallerist for Robert Rauschenberg, whose name was Leo Castelli, who had a gallery at this time that sold tons of cutting-edge work. He was a very powerful gallerist, had a very good way of explaining pretty complex work to collectors and getting them interested in these things. Jasper Johns, for his part, is most famous for creating these works that are American flags. The thing here is that these are also critiques of Greenberg in some way. After all, in a way he's saying, does this break Greenberg's rules? It's a flag is fundamentally a flat form, or at least it orients itself towards us flatly. So can I use this kind of ready-made design for a painting and not break the rules of Greenberg? And Greenberg would say, wait a minute, it's representational, it points outside of itself. But then you might come back and say, but on the other hand, it's totally flat, it's totally optical, so does that really matter? And behind the scenes here, he might have been picking, by the way, American flags, because one of the reasons that Greenberg was so effective in convincing the American public that this was, abstract expressionism was great art was that people were talking about how the Soviet Union, and we're talking about the beginning of the Cold War, was producing works of art that were very, very representational and very, very propagandistic. And oftentimes people would say, look at the Soviet Union, they're so backwards, but we're on that cutting edge of abstraction. So bringing in the American flag and American nationalism might have been one of the things that Rauschenberg was playing around with. By the way, the whole thing is created in this case out of a form of art, painting, that's one of the earliest forms of painting, known as encaustic, which is suspending pigment in wax and painting it on the surface, in this case over newsprint that is behind the whole thing. And then, of course, there's endless iterations of this to bring up other questions, like piling up 3 flags on each other, bringing up the fact that, painting is always three-dimensional, always has some sculptural element to it. So how could you, as Greenberg said, reduce painting to the essence of 2 dimensions when paintings are never 2-dimensional? Or white flags, maybe about, white supremacy, or white, culture, or all those hierarchies that exist in the United States. Or his Ballantine beer cans. This is like the opposite of a Duchamp. This is still Jasper Johns. Once it was said that Leo Castelli could sell anything, and supposedly that was a little bit of a dare to Jasper Johns to see if that was true. What he does here is he takes a ready-made form, a beer can, and he reverses it. Instead of just exhibiting the can, what he does is he casts the can in the kind of most precious age-old form of sculpture, bronze casting, in order to, again, kind of start from the ready-made but work back towards really conventional forms of art. And then he calls it painted bronze, I think to drive Greenberg crazy, because it is paint on the surface of these bronze cast forms, which breaks Greenberg's rules of medium specificity. Final, I'm going to look at, a couple more movements, but the final artist who was really deeply influenced by John Cage, and to a degree Marcel Duchamp, was Robert Morris. This is a work that's actually in the Seattle Art Museum called Box with a Sound of Its Own Making. And here what Morris did in conversation with Cage is he created this walnut box, and as he was creating it, he recorded all of the sounds that went into the creation of this box, from cutting to sanding to nailing it together and so forth. And then those sounds are played from out of the box, so that when you see it, it combines sound with the box itself. And all of those sounds, of course, are created through incidental sounds. They're, derived by chance. They're derived outside of the realm of music. It's supposed to be a way to wake you up to that excellence of everyday life. But what Robert Morris is most famous for are sculptures that were associated with a movement that became known as minimalism. And here you're looking at his untitled I-beams. On the one hand, what he's doing here is like reducing sculpture in the same way that painting had reduced itself to its essence, right? What is sculpture at basis? It's form and volume and space, and that's what it is. So that's part of this, right? Reducing it. But he's reducing it in order to draw attention to something that Greenberg really didn't like. And I know it's quite theoretical, but stick with me for a minute here. What Greenberg said is that everything that is important in a painting is in the painting. And that your job, by extension, as a viewer, is to come be a kind of silent witness in front of the painting. You don't bring any of your own baggage. You don't bring any of your own associations. You are, in essence, a disembodied eye that just is amused or given pleasure by looking without thinking at the visual form. And a lot of artists thought, wow, what a reductive logic, we don't like that. When you reduce all these forms down to their basis, something odd happens that Robert Morris associated with a kind of critique of the idea of a disembodied eye. And that is what he called a kind of dialogue that occurs between what he called the known constant and the experienced variable. These are two different things, but they happen simultaneously. When we look at these untitled L-beams, I'm sure all of us can tell pretty quickly that they're basically the same shape, right? All he's done here is he's taken pieces of plywood and he's formed three basic L shapes, and our brain is just going to look at these, what he called Gestalt shapes, unified shapes, and say, oh, L-beam, right? Three of them, L-beam. That's the known constant. That's what our brain does all the time. It reduces experience down to concepts, to ideas. And after you've got an idea, you don't need to think about it anymore. You just look at it, conceptualize it, don't need to experience it. However, because of the different vantage points or orientations we see these L-beams at, do they look the same to us? No, they look different. And if you can imagine moving around the room and seeing them from different angles, they would constantly be changing. That's the experienced variable. And think about this philosophically. Our mind turns our experiences into concepts. Those concepts, however, are practical. They're utilitarian. They help us to work in a world economically, but they're not accurate, right? They're not our experience. They're not the same things. And how do those two things go together? How does experience play into what is known, right? When can we bring ourselves back to experience and say, this is what matters, versus that efficiency of the mind turning the world into something it already knows? Now, going even further than that, this is very Duchampian in the sense that if these were outside, they would have a totally different feeling. In other words, the entire context in which you view something becomes a part of the experience of the work itself. It's not just the objects. It's the entire museum, gallery space, floor, lighting conditions, everything else that's in there is going to inflect our experience of the work. Our context, what we bring to the work of art, how we see the work of art in this iteration of minimalism really matters. And Greenberg would say, no, that doesn't matter at all. But see, what Greenberg's talking about is a situation that's not really real, that's not really part of our true experience. Let's finish up here with a couple of artists associated with pop art. And pop art, also gets popular late 50s into the early 60s with this turn away from high modernist abstraction and the idea that, a big thing that's happening with this Neo Avant-Garde is that up until this point with abstraction, art's over here in its own little box, right? Its ivory tower. This is art. This is the rest of the world. With the historical avant-garde and with the neo-avant-garde, what they tend to do is say, wait a minute, let's not separate art from the rest of the world. Let's think about art as part of or referring to or making commentary on the world. It's trying to, as they oftentimes say, blur the boundaries between art and life. And pop art does this by taking imagery out of popular culture and asserting it as just as valuable as art. One of the most famous of these artists, of course, is Andy Warhol, who started his career in advertising and then moved over into the fine arts. And some of the most famous works by Andy Warhol, like the Campbell soup cans here, take very, very iconic images from American consumer culture and paint them or silkscreen them later on, show them oftentimes in multiples like you're seeing here, and say, here's art. At the simplest level, one of the things that Andy Warhol might be saying is, if you look at a supermarket display, isn't that just as interesting, or can it be just as interesting as a design as any art that you see in a museum? I tend to think, yeah, okay, whatever. That's fine, but not very appealing to me. On another level, though, one of the things that Andy Warhol has often been interpreted as doing is drawing our attention to how art and consumer culture have a lot of things in common. Here you see very prominently displayed the name, the brand name of the soup, Campbell's. And a brand name works a little bit like the brand name of an artist on an artwork. After all, a lot of people don't pay attention to a work until they're like, oh, that's by a famous artist, and then suddenly it's special. Regardless of whether originally just looking at the work and not recognizing that it was a famous artist, it appealed to you or not, right? You might have looked at it and thought blasé, and then, oh my God, that's a Leonardo? Wow, I'll pay more attention to that. Trademarks, of course, are supposed to guarantee to us some kind of quality in their products in the same way that an artist's brand name guarantees the value of the work of art. Another thing, though, that you might think about is the way that these works interrogate a world that was becoming more and more consumer-oriented, more and more subject to the manipulations of advertising. So a big concept that gets applied to a lot of pop art, in particular Andy Warhol's art, is commodity fetishism. Commodity fetishism. And what a commodity fetish is, well, let's start with fetish. A fetish is always an inanimate object that is ascribed some type of power that it may or may not have. So when you're talking about a fetish in anthropological terms, you're talking about, let's say, a good luck charm or a mask or some kind of object that a culture believes has some kind of power to affect the world. Or you can think of this in Freudian terms and say, like, let's talk about the shoe fetishist. Why does he get so turned on by shoes? Because he has ascribed to that shoe a certain kind of sexual power that it may or may not have. In commodity fetishism, what we're talking about is the way that through advertising, various consumer items are proffered to us, promising something that they probably can't achieve. So with Campbell's Soup, although this is probably way before your time, you can go look at some kind of retro ads for it, and the way it was marketed as instant dinner that allowed mom to do her hair and clean the house and still be happy and just open up a can of soup and heat it up really quickly, and the entire family gathers around the table and everyone's happy, and you've got your white nuclear family and joyous. In other words, Campbell's Soup wasn't selling you, hey, this product is going to taste good and you'll get your nutrition. It was selling you a lifestyle, right? So maybe something of that's in these as well. And here you see something that a lot of people have pointed out is a huge part of advertising. Believe it or not, all of us, on the one hand, want to be understood as individuals, right? As, having our own taste and liking our own things, because that's a mark of our individuality, while also wanting to be a part of a group as well, almost paradoxically. So you don't want to be so far outside of the mainstream that no one gets you. But on the other hand, you want to have your own kinds of taste as well. And here you see it, right? They're all the same. But then you look at it closely and there's little like, oh, that's clam chowder, that's beef, that's cheese, that's bean, that's a little bit of marketing to, you're all part of the Campbell's community, but we've got something for each individual you. And advertising does that all the time. Right? Different iterations of this. And of course, I'm sorry, but there's nothing quite as boring as a huge Andy Warhol exhibit of all this, which may be his other point, which is, basically we live in a culture of commodity serial production and consumption, where one day it's one thing, and then the next day it's the new and improved, and the new and improved. The banal just keeps coming back to us, repeatedly. And the same thing with Coca-Cola, right? All-American Coca-Cola, proffered to the world as an insignia of American, consumer culture, and something that basically is sugar water with barely and some, gas bubbles and barely any flavor that has made millions through primarily its marketing. Or this one. This is another way that Andy Warhol's work is taken to be very cutting edge. What if you can't tell the difference between an Andy Warhol sculpture, the sculpture of Brillo boxes, which he made, and an actual Brillo box, right? What is the difference? What if you can't tell the difference between his item that's made as fine art and an everyday item? And someone like Arthur Danto, a philosopher, has spent kind of the last part of his career trying to tackle this question from philosophical standpoints, arguing that maybe it signals the end of art if artists have so far blurred the boundaries between art and life. How about this? What do you do with Andy Warhol's pictures of Marilyn Monroe? These offset, kind of poorly printed pictures, one after the other, after the other, after the other. Well, what it makes me think of is the way that in our culture we have a kind of cult of celebrity. And one day it's this celebrity and one day it's the next celebrity. And we tend to just treat them as one after the other, an image rather than a real human being, which of course is kind of the way that people thought of Marilyn Monroe, which wasn't even her real name, of course. And when he started creating these, by the way, it was right after her suicide, in which maybe he's, trying to tease out our cult of celebrity, or our interest in, these paper-thin celebrities rather than their own personhood. And there's a lot of indication that some of the things that Andy Warhol's doing are poking fun at our own superficialities. This one's called Before and After, that he created during the age of kind of the beginnings of plastic surgery. To me, one of the most interesting series of works that Andy Warhol ever created started in the mid-1960s, called the American Disaster series. And here, unlike the iconic works of most Andy Warhol, what he did is he took images that were created by beat reporters who were collecting images of tragedies to go in the newspapers and on the news, because nothing sells like a tragedy. This, after all, the 60s, is the age of mass media proliferation. In the 1940s, about 1 in every 4 households had a TV. By the 1960s, every household has at least one television, and the networks are scrambling for ways to reproduce imagery that will get people to tune in. And they do the same things to news papers as well. We all know this. If you ever watch the nightly news, or even on your web browser these days, oftentimes you'll hear a story that's, it's supposed to pull you in, capture your attention about some major catastrophe or tragedy, right, that draws you in, so that for whatever reason we're fascinated by these things, so that you'll stick around and watch the rest of the program, and they can sell ad time. What Andy Warhol did is he took these images that were, again, photographed by other people, and he reproduced these through a silkscreen process, and then titled them things like Red Disaster, or Saturday Disaster, or Orange Disaster, or whatever it might be, as in one disaster after another. Why are we so drawn to these images? I'm going to show you a few of these, right? An electric chair. Again, these images that are meant to be quite impactful. Capital punishment was a big thing on the minds of a lot of people in the 1960s, whether we should be doing it or not. There were a whole series of very high-profile executions that took place. Look at this object that is used to end a human life. I mean, it couldn't be any more kind of medieval. Strap someone to that and then just pump tons of electricity to them and hope that it works, frankly. Or again, these things, doesn't matter if you remember these names. This one's called Saturday Disaster, Red Disaster, Electric Chair, and the one that I'll pause on here, Red Race Riot. One of the things that a lot of critics have pointed out is that Andy Warhol might be pointing to something that had been talked about at least since the beginning of the 20th century by various artists, which is, what is the impact of experiencing our world through media, right? Instead of seeing things firsthand, what happens when that thing that's happening across the world or in some other part of our world comes to us in our living room or on our breakfast table while we're reading the newspaper? How does media in general, in this case photography, distance us from the reality of the world that we are experiencing through it? Here in the Red Race Riots, you're seeing the civil rights movement. You're seeing in particular a moment in which freedom marchers were descending on Birmingham. This is Martin Luther King and his freedom marchers. And the police, under the direction of Ball Connor, who is the chief police, sick dogs on them. And it led to, of course, later on race riots and all kinds of horrible things. Now, these images of this happening were repeated over and over and over in television, in newsprints, right, in Time, in Life magazine. At what point, after seeing these things over and over again, do you become entirely desensitized to the facts of what they're reporting on, right? At what point do they stop becoming real? Does this photograph, which again documents on some level something that actually occurred, at what point, because they're coming to you while you're sitting at your breakfast table, while you're watching TV, as not really real anymore? And what if much of your reality then is virtual in this way and you've become desensitized to this imagery? And we certainly live in this world today, right? We're constantly saturated with really traumatic imagery. What does that do to us? Finally, let's round it out here with something that's supposed to be kind of fun at the end, Claes Oldenburg's work. Claes Oldenburg, he came from Europe. He was a Dutch artist who showed up and probably was overwhelmed by the consumption that takes place in the United States, having come out of a post kind of war Europe that was very, struggling quite heavily with dealing with the mass effects of the war. And so he gets here, he settles down to New York, and he ends up kind of, again, affecting the Duchampian ready-made mode of creating sculptures, where he takes something that already exists in the world and he translates it into a different size or a different medium in order to come up with his sculptures, for different reasons, by the way. But one of his most famous early sculptures was actually part sculpture, part performance, called The Store, in which in Manhattan he, for a month, rented out a storefront and sold little clay sculptures, painted clay sculptures that were in the shape of various consumer items that you might buy at a restaurant. So pieces of chocolate cake and ice creams and ribs or whatever. And the complex part of this was that all of the items were variously priced, so that you might buy, let's say, this piece of pie for exactly the same that you would buy a piece of pie in an actual restaurant, or you might buy another version of that piece of pie, the other piece from the pie, that was priced at the cost of a small sculpture, which is quite a bit more. And one of the things you might have been commenting on is the kind of the age-old dirty secret in the arts, which is, supposedly if you're creating art with a mind to how much you can make out of it, you are selling out, right? That art and commodity shouldn't be thought of in the same sentence, that you're not supposed to be thinking about the business end of your art. That art that is, that an artist is thinking about in terms of selling means that artist isn't serious about their art. But that, you couldn't have a greater fiction than that. Those artists who are out there just creating works of art with no thought about whether they're going to sell them or not aren't really going to be artists, generally speaking, for very long, because they're not going to be able to support themselves. right? So cheeseburger, or some of my favorite sculptures, which is just take an everyday art form. And if you've been downtown at the Olympic Sculpture Park, you've seen his work. That weird circle with the pointy ends off it, that's an old typewriter eraser that he used as the design for that sculpture. Or this one, which is an ice bag that he's made, mammoth size. Or a clothespin that he's fashioned out of steel and out of stainless steel here. And I just think this is a great sculpture. Or his vinyl forms of toothpaste here, where he performed them. He had actually walked down the street holding these things. I love the look on the old lady's face behind him, like, oh my God, that's the biggest toothpaste I've ever seen. This is Costco, right? Or even in some cases, he did works of art that were very political, such as this one called Lipstick Ascending on a Caterpillar Track, which was commissioned by Yale University just a little bit before the famous Kent State massacre, where police opened fire on protester students in Kent State and people were killed. Yale commissioned him to do a work of art that's a commentary on the kind of conflicted nature of the United States at the time. The Caterpillar's tracks would have been associated at this time with tanks. That's what everyone would have thought. And the lipstick, of course, is associated with sex, or with this famous slogan, "Make love, not war," or "put a good face on the war." Anyway, I hope you've had some fun with this lecture. Cage and Duchamp were very influential on this generation of artists. If you're interested in these ideas, of course, there are many classes in the art history department on art since 45 and art since 1960, where we get into these ideas in much greater detail.